Question number 2, Andrew. What's taken so long to get the Kwesi Adofo-Mensah contract done? I believe, when O'Connell got done a couple weeks ago, it was like, barely a week after the playoff loss, and everyone was like, "What's going to happen? What's going to happen?" It's like, okay, yeah, now he's good to go. He's got this multi-year contract now. We don't know exactly how long it is, and we were told at the time that it was, they're working on a deal for Kwesi, and it shouldn't be too much longer. And depending on your definition of not too much longer, this could still qualify as not too much longer, but it felt more imminent than it has proven to be, I guess I'd say.
Yeah, and it could still be coming at any point
Sure.
because as soon as Kevin O'Connell's multi-year extension was done, the Vikings made it known behind the scenes that they were working on Kwesi's and did not want a lack of Kwesi's at the time last month to connotate that they weren't trying to get his deal done. Those negotiations were still ongoing, and it's been radio silence since then in terms of where those deals, where the talks are at, and where the possible agreement, how close that might be, because these are complicated in terms of term length for him, in terms of roster control, in terms of the things he has and hasn't maybe earned in the eyes of the Wilf ownership group at this point. I was not shocked to see Kevin O'Connell's done sooner. When you win 13 games as a head coach twice in your first 3 years, I think those talks will be easier to do than they were with Kwesi. I think Kevin had more of a blank check, to just use a metaphor, than Kwesi does at this point. So I think that's part of it, certainly. And we have to see, if this drags out through the combine, then there's absolutely some question about when is this going to get done. If we look back in the past, some of these have taken months. We look back at Mike Zimmer's, after Mike Zimmer was not on good terms with the team, but after he won the playoff game in 2019 in New Orleans, those extension talks dragged out until like June or July. And that's not to say Kwesi and that ownership group are in the similar place, but those talks are not as clear cut as Kevin O'Connell's, which is why 2-3 weeks later, we're still sitting here wondering, where is that deal? And there's been no sign behind the scenes that they aren't, or that talks have fallen apart. It's just a matter of, I can imagine and project, because I do not know how difficult some of those things might be, because he would not address under his old contract whether he had full 53 control, but my understanding was he did. Does that change at all moving forward? And also the draft history has not been great too. There's just a lot of holes to kind of poke, and you got to wonder where the tug of war is on those talks.
Well, that's absolutely true. And it brings me to a point where we tend to blame a GM for the drafts, and obviously there's input coming out from all over the place, but a lot of that is directly on them, but we tend to praise the free agency too, although there seems to be like this kind of caveat with the Vikings and their free agents in 2024 where some people will say, well, yeah, but that was just O'Connell and especially Flores telling him who they wanted, and then he just executed the plan. So I don't feel like he gets the full credit for the free agents, but he does get the full blame for the draft in the eyes of some. Is that fair? And I say that with knowledge that the drafts have not been good. I wrote about this last week, right after you wrote about how old they were last year. Like, they had one guy against Detroit and the Rams, one draft pick from Kwesi's first 3 drafts, who was either a defensive starter or an offensive starter in those games, and that was Jordan Addison. The Lions had 8 draft picks from those last 3 years playing in that Week 18 game. That is a pretty big difference. That's a problem.
Yeah, I had asked somebody behind the scenes, I think it was within the last year, about that 2022 draft class. And it was last summer as they were getting rid of them. Lewis Cine,
one by one,
Andrew Booth Jr., specifically those 2 guys. And what I was told is that, because my question was, well, how much of that can be blamed on the fact that Kwesi was coming in as a new GM, and all of you guys, not the scouts who had stayed from the previous regime to the new administrators like Ryan Grigson, Demetrius Washington coming in, how much was that because you were trusting Ed Donatel to kind of lead and decide what you needed defensively? You had an offensive head coach in Kevin O'Connell who was not making those kinds of defensive decisions for you. You needed your defensive leader in Donatel to guide those picks. And I was told by somebody high up in the Vikings front office that, well, those first and second round picks should be coordinator proof. Well, they were not. And I do think that it is a reasonable thing to blame those those picks on the fact that Donato was the leading voice defensively and what they needed at that spot. That's not to say that high up administrators and scouting people didn't have opinions, but they needed to fit somebody like Lewis Seen, who they thought was a great fit with a 4 kind of deep shell defense, keeping the safeties deep and crashing down low. They thought Seen was a perfect fit for that. And that's not what Brian Flores does. He was not a fit at all for what Brian Flores does. And so as much as you can have scouting phrases that say first and second round picks should be coordinator proof, they just aren't. And I think his slow start in the draft, and especially the top of the draft defensively, can be tied to the fact that, yeah, Brian Flores wasn't here. And then Brian Flores conversely makes some of your free agent picks look smart when he says, as Flores told us, Andrew Van Ginkel was on our short list, or my short list personally, of guys I wanted to go after in free agency last year. That wasn't necessarily the case with Jonathan Grenard, who was an amazing find just as well for them that Kwesi added, or Harrison Phillips 2 years prior in his first free agency, or Josh Oliver in his second free agency. They found guys, Byron Murphy in his second, Kwesi's second free agency. They found a lot of guys that they try to get off of rookie contracts, plug them in as these long-term kind of short and long-term fixes. And I do think they've done a good job of that, but none of these things can be independent. You ask, how fair is it to give Kwesi the blame without necessarily giving him all the credit for those decisions? That's how the job goes. It's every sport. It's baseball, it's basketball, the front offices, the scouts, everybody coming together. The GM can't do everything. He's just going off of what the evals coming in are. He's trusting his groups that are scouting the Northeast or the Southeast or whatever. Yeah, this is all collective stuff. And when even going back to Kellen Mond with Rick Spielman, one of the worst
trying to make
picks.
Zimmer leave the room again?
One of the worst picks in Vikings certainly recent Vikings history. Kellen Mond going atop of the 3rd round that year. He was the Senior Bowl MVP. So many people in that building liked him. That was not just a Rick Spielman pick. He pissed Mike Zimmer off, as you mentioned.
Yes.
He told Mark Craig that he left the room after Kellen Mond was picked. But Rick Spielman was not the only person that liked him. I had scouts, or a scout, I remember before that draft, texting me from the Vikings building that they liked Kellen Mond more than Justin Fields in that draft. Now, neither of them are franchise quarterbacks, but Justin Fields is a better quarterback.
Yes.
So that's not Rick saying that. That's another scout. So you got to trust your evaluators. And yeah, you miss, you hit, you miss. And obviously the good teams are the ones that hit more than they miss. The good scouting teams, I think of like Baltimore, Pittsburgh, Kansas City, Philly, teams that consistently draft well and hit in those spots. And the Vikings have hit on some draft picks, but certainly they've had plenty of misses under this regime.
I don't know that we'll ever know, assuming Kwesi does get his extension sometime here soon. I don't know if we'll ever know the exact terms of it, but how awkward would it be if they are coming to him, or they eventually come to him and say, we're not going to kind of line this up just the way it was before. You're going to be on a different kind of timeline as Kevin O'Connell. There might be a little bit more shared power there. Like how would that make things awkward? How tenable is that?
Yeah, and I would imagine it would make it awkward. Naturally, there's no way around that. I would imagine the Wilfs, though, after having, because they're not necessarily in the football offices every day, but they are around enough to know how bad it was with Rick Spielman and Mike Zimmer, as we found out after the fact, not even talking to each other toward the end of their tenure together. There's no indication that Kevin and Kwesi are anywhere near that kind of tension or issues, but you could start it pretty quick by saying, hey, Kwesi, we're just going to give you a 2-year deal, even though we just gave Kevin, which we don't know his terms, but let's say a 4-year deal or whatever. Yeah. I think the Wilfs would be mindful of that, and they'd be smart to be mindful of that. If they're reckless and they come in there and say, hey, we think you've earned only up to this, and that's what we're going to do. I do think that would naturally create some tension behind the scenes and create questions internally about who's really in charge here. Did Kwesi get the 53 control if he got a shorter deal than Kevin? Does Kevin have control over the quarterback decision instead of Kwesi? There's some questions there if they don't keep those guys in lockstep. And I think not only publicly, but privately, internally, they've wanted that kind of hierarchy pretty clear, and that those guys are a packaged pair that they brought in together and want to keep together. But like we said, the reason this deal isn't done, the reason these talks have gone along, it's pretty easy to speculate that it's because it's not as cut and dry as it was with Kevin. And I do imagine whether it's a team option or, because there's ways you can finagle it, excuse me, where you can say you're under the same amount of, you're under contract for the same amount of years together, but there might be some backdoors or outs in Kwesi's deal that wouldn't exist in Kevin's.